let's start.
Okay, John, we are online. We are at the end of a second very long day of a conference on the future of Europe. And so you may ask yourself why somebody from LA is involved in such a thing. Actually, we made the specific choice that Europe should also look to ideas outside Europe. And as a matter of fact, in the last plenary session, we had few people from China, we had people from South Africa, from, of course, many people from UK who are also here. And well, I will leave it in a second to Angela Giuffrida from The Guardian. We may also be joined by Ernest Wilson, who is a sort of uncle of mine, one of the people, who is a former dean of the Annenberg School of Communication. For quite many students who are here, Jonathan Taplin is a star, a movie producer living in LA. He was involved into early years of his career in producing a concert of somebody called Bob Dylan. So, yeah, okay. And so he's a sort of living legend. Without further delay, I will pass to Angela, who will try to introduce the discussion that we are having today on move fast, break things, which is very much about the digital age that we are living.
Hi, John. Lovely to meet you. Hello. I apologize if I sound sleepy. Francesco has really worn us out over the last couple of days in Siena with lots of wine. But if you would like to first tell us about your book, because I'm not sure everyone in the audience, has read it or is aware of it. Thank you.
Yeah, I think what I want to do is show you a few slides. It'll take 10 or 12 minutes and kind of set the table. And then from there, we can kind of have a discussion with Ernie and Francesco and everybody and the audience as well. What I want to do is not just talk about a book that I wrote in 2016, which was Move Fast and Break Things, but what I'm really concerned about is what the future looks like. And so this is a new book that I'm writing right now, which will come out in the summer of next year. And it's called The End of Reality, the Metaverse, Mars, Crypto, and the Age of Unreason. And I noticed your conference is called Your Man in the Moon moment, and this is really the Man in Mars moment. So, so Move Fast and Break Things was a book about techno-determinism. And what I mean about that is that since Google was founded in 2003, we have kind of acceded to the big tech companies, the total governance of everything. And when I wrote Move Fast and Break Things, the subtitle was How Facebook, Google, and Amazon Cornered Culture and Undermined Democracy. And ironically, my English publisher asked to take out the words undermine democracy because he couldn't imagine that something like Facebook could have any effect on democracy. And obviously, I insisted that it stay in, and then the Cambridge Analytica scandal was revealed in England about 2 months later, and so I didn't have to argue about it. This is a quote on the screen from the Eurasia Group, which is, to me, to my mind, one of the most respected analytical groups. Your personal information will be hacked, algorithms fed with biased data will make destructive decisions that affect how billions of people live, work, and love. Online mobs will create chaos, inciting violence and sparking runs on stocks. Tens of millions of people will be dragged down the rabbit holes of conspiracy theories. The one thing all of these realities have in common is that they emanate from digital space, where a handful of big tech companies, not governments, are the main actors and enforcers. So I see big tech as what the French call rentiers, classic rent takers. And their effect on the media of all other kinds is incredibly destructive. On the top left, you see the chart of newspaper revenues since Google was founded. And obviously, they have fallen precipitously. On the chart on the bottom right, you see the chart of music business revenues, which were 22 billion a year in 1999 before Napster arrived. And even though they have recovered some because of the streaming of Spotify and Apple Music and others, it's still not even back to half of what it was in 1999. On the top right is a chart of productivity in the non-farm business sector, which you can see fell precipitously from 2007 to 2015. You will probably note that Facebook really began to have a large audience starting in 2007. And I would probably argue that productivity fell because a lot of people were wasting their time on Facebook rather than doing their work. And anyone who teaches in academia, where you have a classroom of people with all their computers open, you probably will guess that most of them are spending their time on Facebook, not writing notes about your lecture. The final chart on the bottom left is the gross profit margin of Facebook. And what I want you to understand that there is no company in the world that has an 80% gross profit margin. Now, how is that? That is because Facebook does not have to pay to create any of its content. Facebook does not have to pay to distribute any of its content. And therefore, it has profit margins which, compared to, say, Apple, which is in the high 40%, Google, which is maybe 50%, Walmart, which is 28%, and Ford Motor Company, which is 18%. You know, these businesses are extraordinary. One last thing I want to mention is that in the music business, even though streaming has created great new revenue streams, and when I was working for Bob Dylan in the 60s and 70s, we used to talk about Pareto curves, and the idea was that 80% of a record company's revenue would come from 20% of the product. Today, 90% of the revenue on streaming comes from 1% of the product. So Jay-Z and Beyonce and Adele and Taylor Swift are doing quite well, but most of the content is not making a living. So what we are now faced with is a group of libertarian billionaires in the United States who are putting forth this new idea that we're going into Web3. And Web3 is a combination of things. It's you're going to live in the metaverse with a helmet on for 7 hours a day, and all your meetings and most of your life will be done in virtual reality. And you will buy things in that world using crypto tokens. Now, the pandemic has been great for these 5 people. So on the top left is Peter Thiel. You may not know him that well, but he was the original investor in PayPal. He was the first investor in Facebook and the largest shareholder outside of Mark Zuckerberg. He is a person who has said that democracy and capitalism are no longer compatible. And obviously he wants to have capitalism, but is not so interested in democracy. In the middle is, of course, Elon Musk smoking a joint on the radio show. And he is a man who is, you know, kind of all over the world. And we're going to talk a lot about him in a second. On the far right is Mark Andreessen, Mr. Conehead, and he is the largest holder of all crypto assets in the United States, by far, his firm, Andreessen Horowitz. Down on the bottom left is, of course, Jeff Bezos celebrating 2022, because for these people, as the Washington Post pointed out, the pandemic was great. The global pandemic added about $1 trillion to the net worth of America's tech elite, and 1/5 of that haul went into the pockets of two men, Jeff Bezos and Elon Musk. In 2017, when Facebook first debuted, the richest person in the world was one of the Walmart heirs, and she had a fortune of 15 billion. This year, Elon Musk's fortune, before he made the stupid move to try and buy Twitter, was 290 billion. And of course, at the bottom, looking like a hostage, is Mark Zuckerberg, responsible for wrecking democracy all over the world. Now, there are two visions of the future of where we can go, you know, and quite frankly, one of the visions that I think is more European is that we should use our collective wealth to try and save the planet we live on. Whether it's high-speed rail, clean up the air, reduce carbon emissions, give everybody health care, give everybody a good education, and basically spend our life trying to improve our planet. But there's two other visions that compete with this. Both Musk and Bezos believe that we're going to have to abandon the planet. Thus, they're spending their billions and the billions of the United States Treasury on going to Mars, which I think is probably one of the craziest ideas that ever has been in. And in other words, the Earth would remain as a kind of Disneyland theme park, which you would visit from your space thing, and that all manufacturing would be moved into space, and the Earth would be kind of a place you would visit to remember what life was like in the old days. But there is a darker vision in these tech libertarians, which is that the future will create a kind of new class of people, which English economists are calling the precariat. So as you can see from the chart on the top left, we've always had the ruling class, and we have a working class, mostly who have unions and some kind of pension and some kind of health care in the United States. But you have a new class called the precariat. And the precariat have no health care, have no unions, have no steady jobs. They're all freelancers. And a lucky group of them above the application program interface tell computers what to do. They design web pages, they write code, but a much larger group of them live below the API, and computers tell them what to do. So that's the Uber driver, the Amazon warehouse worker. And in the next 10 years, most of them will be replaced by the computers and the robots. There is no doubt in my mind that an Amazon warehouse in 2030 will have maybe 5 to 10 employees and 10,000 robots. So all these companies which are pushing this kind of new gig economy have combined together to push an idea in the US called universal basic income. And the basic idea is there will be a large value-added tax on every transaction that you make, and that will all go to fund everyone who's been put out of work by the robots and the artificial intelligence to sit at home. And obviously, Mr. Zuckerberg and Mr. Andreessen and Mr. Thiel believe that these people will be sitting on home with not much to do. And so why wouldn't they spend 7 to 8 hours a day in virtual reality, in the metaverse? Now, the biggest lie of Web3 is this notion that it will somehow bring democracy to the web, that the old regime of the large monopolies, tech monopolies, will be gone. But as Jack Dorsey of Twitter says, this is a lie. You don't own Web3. The VCs, like Mark Andreessen and their limited partners, do. It will never escape their incentives. It is ultimately a centralized entity with a different label. Know what you're getting into. So down on the bottom right is a chart of, for instance, Bitcoin. 95% of Bitcoin is owned by 2% of the Bitcoin holders. And as Stephen Deal, the very important computer scientist in the United States, says, it's the age-old pitch of charlatans and snake oil salesmen, except this time around it's being pushed by the world's largest investors, like Andreessen and Thiel, who have deep bags of tokens to dump. In other words, the people that started Bitcoin own 90% of the tokens, and they're using them in a classic pyramid scheme to push things out. Now, Ben Thompson, the great analyst, has a theory called aggregation theory, which is that when services compete without constraints of geography or marginal cost, dominance is achieved by controlling demand, not supply, and winners take most. So that defines Google, Facebook, Amazon, Instagram, you got it. So in an attempt to push crypto out to everyone, people like Andreessen and the companies he controls started in late November of last year a huge $250 million TV advertising campaign to get everyone on crypto. And they featured people like Mark Damon and Larry David and LeBron James and many other celebrities pushing crypto. And I love this phrase, fortune favors the brave. So if you were one of the brave and listened to these TV advertising that were in late November and December during the Super Bowl, you would have bought Bitcoin at about $60,000 a coin, and today it's below $30,000 a coin. So you would have lost all your money. You may have been brave, but you weren't fortunate. So what is the metaverse? So the metaverse is a place where you will create an avatar. You will pay money to create this avatar. You will pay money to clothe this avatar from major brands like Gucci and everything, which will sell you virtual hip clothing for you to put on your avatar. And you won't have to buy any pants because the avatars won't have any legs, because it's too much computing power to do that. Andreessen says we should build, and we are building, online worlds that make life and work and love wonderful for everyone, no matter what level of reality deprivation they find themselves in. Now think about that. What does he mean by reality deprivation? Are there people who have committed suicide from drugs in the last year, which is a record number of people? Are they reality deprived? I would guess so. But this notion that you will be bored or whatever, and you will be able to wear this helmet all day is pretty crazy. So Facebook is not just, now it's called Meta, is not just content to have you put this helmet on. They are working on an alternative helmet which will essentially read your brain waves. So you're in this metaverse on the virtual mall, and you're going down the virtual Via Condotti, and you see something and it triggers something in your brain, and an electrical impulse goes off and it records that. And then, of course, needless to say, it's going to keep showing you that product until you finally touch it and buy it, both the virtual version of it, but you can also buy the real version of it, because it will have your sizes and everything. And all of this will just be a much deeper version of surveillance capitalism. But I think that we also have to realize that the real killer app of the metaverse will be virtual sex. If any of you remember Second Life, which was the last attempt at something like the metaverse, it ended in a kind of cesspool of ugly virtual sex. And of course, everybody is working on this pretty hard to make maybe the virtual sex a little bit better this time, but I don't think that other than virtual sex and first-person shooter games, there isn't much, I believe, that you will want in the metaverse. And quite frankly, the idea that you would spend 8 hours with that helmet on is, to me, a stretch. So what about crypto? Well, let's be honest. The only people who really need crypto are criminals. So as you can see from this chart, between crypto fraud, which was up 79% in 1 year, and ransomware attacks, which uses crypto to get paid, that's about $35 billion attributed to crypto crime last year. And of course, cryptocurrencies are being used to evade sanctions in Russia right now. And so crypto is essentially a solution in search of a problem. When El Salvador introduced crypto as a legitimate currency, now in the 9 months since that happened, only 5% of the transactions in El Salvador are actually done on Bitcoin. And most people don't use it. And if you want to use an ATM to transfer your Bitcoin into real cash, the processing fees are 17%. So let's talk about this other thing called NFTs. So Andreessen and Thiel own OpenSea, which is the biggest NFT market, where you can buy Bored Apes and other stupid things that they call art, but I don't really think they are. But as the Wall Street Journal recently reported, OpenSea, the largest NFT platform, recently admitted that it had found that more than 80% of the NFTs created using its software were plagiarized work, fake collections, and spam. So the Walt Disney Company, needless to say, is not getting a cent from this NFT, which sold for about $2 million. Now, the person tried to resell it last week, and he couldn't get a bid more than $1,000. So those of you who did think that you were going to make a fortune investing in NFTs have been equally disappointed. Finally, I just want to touch on this one other thing. So Elon Musk wants us to spend $25 trillion to put a colony on Mars. So as the New Scientist pointed out, if we ever send astronauts to explore Mars, they'd have to bring their own oxygen with them. And as Brian Kahn, the professor at Columbia, says, producing, say, an electric Ford Bronco or even an Amazon Echo in space is quite possibly the dumbest idea I have ever heard. It already requires skilled workers and robots right here on Earth. What Musk and Bezos are proposing would require ensuring technologies work in zero gravity, or that we perfectly emulate gravity in space, getting raw materials up to your Ford Bronco space station, then transporting said Bronco back to Earth. In other words, this is the nuttiest idea that anybody ever had, and Musk is managing to get NASA to give him billions of dollars to keep pursuing this vision. Now, there's a meme going around America, which is that reincarnation is real. In other words, that Elon Musk is the reincarnation of Thomas Edison. But there's a huge difference between what Edison did and what Musk is doing. Edison invented things for the average person. An electric light bulb made your life better. The phonograph made it possible to get entertainment without spending a lot of money. But Musk makes things for only the rich. That car that you see costs about $125,000, and it's really for venture capitalists who want a virtue signal that they're environmentally sensitive. So what do? Well, unlike my worries about social media and everything, I don't think it's too early to start the resistance. And so the resistance is simple. Don't buy a virtual reality helmet, don't buy crypto, and don't fund stupid space trips to Mars. It seems to me the EU regulators have been much smarter than the Americans in trying to regulate big tech. But right now, the Biden Federal Trade Commission is trying to force Facebook to sell both Instagram and WhatsApp, which would assure that the rent-taking monopoly on social media advertising is ended. Cryptocurrency certainly needs to be brought under some regulatory purview. In the US, we call it the Securities Exchange Commission, and there's a big battle going on that. NFTs should not be able to take anybody's intellectual property and sell it for money, and so there's pretty simple ways to detect that. And finally, I think the EU Digital Markets Act is a really good start. And as I said before, I think that in a way, you're way ahead of us in doing that. So I'm going to close the slides out now, and then hopefully we can all have a conversation. Thank you very much.
Very much, John. And now welcome Ernest Wilson.
Can you turn it up a little bit? Much better.
Thanks very much, John. And now over to Ernest Wilson III. Thank you.
Excellent. Well, first of all, I want to thank all of you, especially Francesco, for launching this conversation, continuing this conversation as you have already over the past 2 years. And this is hugely important, not only because of the short-term challenges we're seeing in Ukraine and elsewhere, but also, as we all know, because we are making a transition from an industrial age into a digital and computer age, which is creating all sorts of losses as well as huge gains for a limited number of people. I want to thank Jonathan Taplin for drawing our attention to this issue of the metaverse, which only will become more and more important. And so what I want to do is just take a couple of moments, John, and follow up on your commentary and reflect a few conversations I've had with Francesco and ask these questions. Number one, so what? Who is affected by these major changes? Secondly, if we oppose or support these ideas, what can we do as intellectuals and activists? And how do we mobilize people, not only intellectually, but how do we translate perhaps our frustration about the metaverse into human behaviors? So those are the sort of themes that I want to address. And I would agree with Jonathan, which is that the United States can learn a lot from what the regulatory resources are doing in Europe today. You guys are ahead of us. There was an article in the New York Times yesterday in which one of our leading senators said that while the Biden administration is going to push for intellectual property protection and the public interest, the large enterprises that John Taplin just identified are already spending tens of millions of dollars to prevent that from happening. So let me start off by saying that we will understand this a lot better if we remember what happened with the birth of the internet. At the birth of the internet in Silicon Valley and in other parts of the world, the idea was that this would be good for everyone, that the internet would promote democracy. It would cut down on transaction costs and hence improve efficiency, et cetera, et cetera. And for some of us who can remember that time, when we chose to say, well, perhaps it won't all be positive, we were criticized. I'm sure John remembers this. And I remember being told, well, Ernie, why are you trying to be so critical of the internet? Don't you know this is going to be wonderful for everyone? And some of us said, well, there will be positive, but there will be negative as well. So we are now at a similar moment. There's the Web3, as it is now called. There are other forms of technology which we are told will bring unfettered competition, entertainment, and even increased democratic participation through the metaverse. And I think we should be much more skeptical for the reasons that Professor Taplin is describing. So I think the first step that we want to do is to define the metaverse. Putting on my academic hat, of course, that's the first step. But one definition is the Zuckerberg meta definition, which is one engaging, solid company that would do everything in the metaverse. But in fact, whether you look at another large company like not only Facebook, but there are others, Microsoft, who make the argument that don't focus on the metaverse as one big thing. It consists of a vertically integrated industrial sector, service sector, that's going to have a lot of competition all up and down that vertical structure. So there's a history to what we are struggling against, and what you are doing in Europe is ahead of what we're doing right now in the United States. Who are going to be the stakeholders in this? Well, there are stakeholders who recognize their self-interest and are taking steps. There are others who will be affected by it. And I think the goal of those of us who are in think tanks and who are doing studies like Professor Taplin the first step that we have to do is to define the downside as well as the upside of the metaverse and identify those interests, those stakes, those stakeholders who must be mobilized if we are to turn this into a positive civic democratic outcome, or if we will allow those 5 or 6 meta trillionaires to control it. And so I'm just going to suggest a couple of things. Who are the stakeholders? Well, technological change, as you all know, is not invented by one sector or one set of companies. So let's just say there are 4 who must be engaged in the kind of political work that we are talking about. Number 1 should be NGOs, non-governmental organizations, who need to come together and analyze and think about what is the impact of this metaverse scheme on the groups in civil society that we should care about. That's number 1. Number 2, what are the political agencies of government that can actually take those steps to introduce the positive incentives that we all need in and around the metaverse? Those can be national government agencies like the Federal Communication Commission, the Federal Trade Commission in the United States, its counterparts in Europe, as well as international organizations that can take those kinds of very, very necessary steps. A third one is companies. We need to engage with people who are not entirely behind the meta version of this new invention, this new technology. So can we put together coalitions of companies that are more critical, that feel threatened in their startup positions by these large billion, trillion-dollar companies? And if so, who are they? And what are their interests? How do you carve up the interests of companies within the corporate sector, non-governmental organizations and nonprofits, various forms of government? And then for us, what is our requirement as intellectuals, as policy intellectuals, as analysts, and as teachers? I feel this very strongly. I have been teaching a course on the metaverse, and I'm discovering among my students, this is a course in media and economics, is that the emerging impact of the metaverse as an idea is, how can I put this, is somewhat depressing for my students, because it seems like such a major impediment to what they would like to do with their agency and their ability to start up new ideas, that the metaverse just seems as an overwhelmingly negative introduction that cannot be addressed. So I think our role, I think the role of our think tanks is, yes, to make positive policy recommendations, yes, to suggest things to companies, but the first step has got to be going out into our constituencies, our students, the people who believe strongly in democracy and entrepreneurs, starting up new ideas, in order to convince them that we are facing a serious moment. So what I would put on the table is and propose is this question: can we put together a coalition, a conversation around the around this metaverse idea and its other implications, so that in Italy, in the UK, in France, in Switzerland, all over the world, we can launch a conversation. I think Jonathan Taplin called it the resistance. And there's certainly enough science fiction movies where those who were resisting were able to win. But I think we should build on that idea and say, let us pull together a coalition of people who want to be critical of this new evolution in technology, because the downside risk of locking all of us into headsets where the content is provided by very few content producers is not a utopian future. It is very much a dystopian future. And I would say that all of us who are on this call have an ethical and political responsibility. We have a family responsibility if we have children or grandchildren to address this in a way that is direct and timely. So again, I want to thank Jonathan and others who have participated in this conversation, and look forward, Francesco, to having even more of a conversation today and moving into the future. Thank you.
Hey, Francesco, Ernie just posed two really critical questions, and I'd like to just kind of respond to them. First thing I would say that the five men that I've been talking about don't care about democracy at all. That's not an issue to them. They have only one interest, which is maintain their political and money power. They are the richest people in the world, and they don't want that to change. So the second issue that Ernie raised is who is affected by these major changes like the metaverse? And I would argue that everyone is. If you imagine that your children or your children's children grow up wearing a virtual reality helmet 8 hours a day, they will emerge as a different species. They will not be human. These people believe in a theory called transhumanism, which is that man can be enhanced by technology. If you imagine their favorite movie, The Avengers, and Tony Stark, who is Elon Musk's, doppelganger, he puts on this suit and he goes from being a drunken playboy to saving humanity by putting on this special suit, which gives him superpowers and he can fly through the air and everything. Their desire is that you escape from reality. That's the big deal. They don't want you paying any attention. And Ernie talked about utopian versus dystopian literature. In the 30s and 40s, there were two great books of science fiction. One was Brave New World by Aldous Huxley, and the other was 1984 by George Orwell. In 1984, the Big Brother enforced his power by a boot on your neck and by watching you and spying on you and threatening you. But I believe that Huxley was onto something much more real, which was in Brave New World, the government handed out a nice drug to everybody called Soma, which was a kind of half Viagra, half Prozac. And then everybody didn't have much to do. They were given money And so they spent most of their time in what was called the feelies, which was essentially the metaverse, these all enveloping things. And the government didn't have to do anything to threaten the populace. They were so blissed out that they didn't object to anything. And I believe that, you know, Peter Thiel and Mark Zuckerberg have a very dark view of the future. They really do believe that 40 to 50% of the people in your room will not have a job. You will have been replaced by artificial intelligence. And for those of you who think that that's just going to affect truck drivers, let me tell you that I was at a law firm a few months ago, and the head of their technology division said, you know, I used to, when I get a new case, have to put 5 fresh out of law school students in a law library to research it for 2 or 3 weeks. And he says, now I just turn on the artificial intelligence research machine and it spits out all the relevant data from all US case law in about 6 hours. And I said, well, what do you do with the fresh out of law school kids? He said, well, I put them in front of the computer and tell them not to touch anything. And he says, but I don't need as many as I used to. You know, at USC, where Ernie and I both worked, they're still training radiologists. And those radiologists are borrowing a lot of money to get that training in the hopes that they're going to have a job that'll pay them $160,000 a year. In 4 to 5 years, a radiologist will be a person, a clerk, who carries the artificial intelligence reading of the X-ray or the scan and carries it over to the patient and gives them the good or bad news. That is not a job that will pay $160,000. So I believe that Zuckerberg and Musk and Andreessen and Thiel and Bezos have a pretty clear vision of where they think the world is going. And it's a world without work. And, you know,
can I just put down one point, which is you have talked about the 0.001% of the population, those 5 guys. What the pandemic has also shown us is not only that happening, but partially as a result of that, the world is becoming hugely unequal in terms of wealth. And so what we have seen happening at the same time is pulling the covers off racial inequality, class inequality, demographic inequality, and death rates, suicide rates, unemployment. We can see that on every screen.
You, Ernest, we can't hear you from
Yes.
our end. That's
Yes,
better.
yeah, all I was saying is that at the same time that we see this growth of a small group of people at the top, those at the bottom who are attracted to nationalist kinds of solutions are also becoming more politically mobilized. So I think, to build on what John was saying, not only do the people at the top not have our interest in mind and they want to go against that, but the folks at the other end of the class distribution are suffering because of the bad choices that have been made about taxation, regulation, et cetera. So I just think that puts it in an even more stark context.
I agree, Ernie, but if you actually look at, let's say, the crypto advertising thing, so much of that advertising is being aimed at people at the low end of the income scale that somehow by buying some Bitcoin, you're going to get wealth, that you're going to create wealth for yourself and your family that you've never had before, and you may not have a house or whatever, but and they're using athletes like Steph Curry and LeBron James to pitch it, you know, and quite frankly, the percentage of people of color who have bought crypto is higher than the percentage of non-people. So, I mean, it's a very cynical situation that's going on. And the second thing is to say is that the people who are using the nationalism thing, and you know, it's not just Trump, and it's not just Bolsonaro, and it's not just Modi, and it's not just Putin, and it's not just, you know, Erdogan, but they're all using social media to spread their disinformation and their propaganda. And you know, the more you research this stuff, the more you know that the people who own the social media platforms know exactly what they're doing. And quite frankly, Elon Musk wants to buy one, so he will have the power to influence politics even more than he does already.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Do you wanna
Yeah, can I say something? John, Ernest, Francesco here. I have a question and also a quick reflection. I was really captured, even emotionally, by John's presentation, and this is also quite paradoxical that you have such a view of on where are we going. By two people who actually were born and grew up in a state which is called California, which is the very state where Elon Musk, Mark Zuckerberg, and all the rest actually live and work. However, my question would be a little bit on the last slide that John presented, because I want to elaborate a little bit on so what that and Ernest was also raising. So what do we do? No, because that last slide contained, John, a number of don't wear helmet, which is actually something that I personally would like to do, at least to understand how does the stupid thing work. Don't buy crypto. And by the way, as your last point, you mentioned the Digital Market Act, which is actually a list of things that you do not do at the global digital platforms. Do not have to do, otherwise there is a fine, no? But I was just wondering whether is there also something that we can do in terms of market failures, of things that markets and Silicon Valley did not manage to imagine, no? Things that, for instance, have to do with, as we discussed with Ernest, with education, with healthcare. I'm actually writing, as Ernest very much knows, a book which is called Internet of Beings, where you have this vision of internet entering into the bodies of the people, which is again can be a dystopic vision, but you know, I also know that technologies sometimes was used to make people to live better, you know. We are now talking with our friends in LA using a technology called Zoom, if I'm not wrong, which was invented, by the way, by a Chinese engineer who has been investigated a number of times by FBI for being a spy of the Chinese Communist Party, who lives in LA. No? And we are outside this entire story, you know, we as Europeans. So my question to you is there something that we can do in terms of bending technologies to human needs?
Right. So Francesco, I think that's the critical question. You know, when when Zuckerberg announced the metaverse, the internal of Meta, there was a poll of employees. What do you think of this? And the most upvoted question on the poll was, how will this not just become an opiate for the masses, like an addiction? And Zuckerberg was not able to answer that question in an employee forum. But here's the deal. It seems to me Ernie and I are both old enough to remember a fairly famous saying from the 60s, which is, are you part of the solution or part of the problem? And every single person in tech is going to have to answer that question. And I don't mean just Elon Musk and Mark Zuckerberg. I mean every person who's writing code, every person who's designing websites, and everyone's going to have to answer that question. Because it does seem to me that unlike the situation that we faced with social media, this is early enough along that the adoption curve on, say, people buying virtual reality helmets is so low that it can be stopped before it gets too far. In other words, in the whole world of the universe, Facebook has sold about 10 million of those devices. And according to a very smart analyst, the abandonment rate is very high. In other words, people buy them and they try it for a little bit and then they don't use them. And that there maybe 3 million people who are using virtual reality from Meta right now on a weekly basis. So it says to me that it's early enough that actual human agency can have an effect. In other words, a lot of individual decisions to not be involved in this are there. It was too late to say, well, you shouldn't have a smartphone. Everybody's got a smartphone. You need a smartphone, but you don't need to put on a virtual reality helmet and go into the metaverse to go shopping. You can actually go to the real Via Condotti and do what you want to do. You don't have to go to the virtual Via Condotti. And quite frankly, all those companies like Gucci who are clamoring to get into the metaverse and sell you Gucci outfits for your avatar should stop that. You know, they're being stupid. They're in the classic FOMO, fear of missing out. They won't look hip if they don't get involved in this. And needless to say, Meta is spending millions to try and get people to come along for the ride. So I think we can stop this. I think there is real resistance. And as far as the regulators, they shouldn't stop trying to break up these companies. They're still monopolies. Let's be clear. Google has 92% of the search advertising market. No, it's a monopoly worldwide. And in the past, we've had ways of dealing with that. You know, in the US, Ernie and I will both remember that AT&T was a telephone monopoly in the 50s. And the government forced them to license for free every single piece of intellectual property they owned in order to retain that. So that was the transistor, the laser, the cellular system, the satellite system, all the property that Bell Labs invented had to be licensed for free. And that, of course, was the beginning of Silicon Valley, because then Intel and Fairchild Semiconductor and Motorola and Texas Instrument got all those free patents in order to compete. And that was the big change.
Let me just answer in 2 sentences the question that Francesco raised. One is that as a teacher, who is spending a lot of my time teaching underserved Black and brown kids of agricultural workers, I really believe that my students could benefit greatly from a technology that could help teach them soft skills of empathy, adaptability, intellectual curiosity. Secondly, that there's growing demand for how do we make better doctors? How do we make better teachers? How do we make better parents if we can draw on certain aspects of the metaverse? And here I think I probably disagree with my friend Jonathan that the horse has left the barn in many ways. This is a bad metaphor, but I don't think we can stop the metaverse. I think we have to subvert the metaverse. We have to empower analysis and deep criticism to turn it into something that the five guys that you've identified are not interested in at all, but the other 5 billion people on the planet would find it useful. And that in some ways is an empirical question. Can we mobilize people to build up healthcare? I mean, I sit on the board of a healthcare foundation. We need those kinds of skills, those kinds of insights that this new technology can, in principle, provide, but it will not happen on its own.
Ernie, you'll be surprised to know that I agree with you in the following sense. You and I both know when we were at USC that we would go over to the Institute for Creative Technologies, which was a think tank at USC funded by the military. And they had a virtual reality application for soldiers who were coming back from Iraq,
Right.
who had PTSD, post-traumatic stress
disorder.
And for short periods of time, you didn't wear the helmet for more than 40 minutes, but it actually could put you in situations where you could overcome the stress that was making you crazy. Here was a soldier that every time a car would backfire, he would get under the bed. You know, I mean, he was so traumatized. And somehow you could slowly bring them out of that fear thing. So I believe that there are decent uses of these technologies. And certainly, you know, doctors doing robotic surgery with a helmet on, it's useful. But none of this is what Mark Zuckerberg is interested in.
Right.
He's interested in pulling out of your brain every piece of data he can to sell you more stuff and to put more advertisements in front of you that you cannot avoid because you're wandering around this virtual world that he can put stuff in front of your face that you have no power over. And to think that you have some freedom and some agency inside Mark Zuckerberg's metaverse is pure insanity.
So what do we, for those of us who are on the outside, John, I guess what I'm saying is, in the same way that you've written in your book, one of your books, the first book, about what Bob Dylan and that group of people did with, and Joan Baez and others,
The civil rights movement.
They created a counter movement.
Culture. Yes.
Their language was anti-authoritarianism.
Right.
It was inclusion. It was against racism.
Right.
And in favor of people who were losing out at that point. So what I just want to put at the front of our conversation is what can we do as intellectuals and cultural workers to create that same kind of understanding and vision that have emerged in earlier periods of European culture, American culture, African culture, et cetera, so we can start moving this in the right direction.
Well, what we have to do is say that we're on team human. In other words, that humanism, as opposed to algorithms, is do we want the world to be run by algorithms and by machines, or do we want the world to be run by humans? And we have to make a decision, because once you put that helmet on, you've lost your humanity, and you won't get it back. And the point is that we have to stand up to this. And to my mind, it's a resistance, and it's, whatever way we have to do it. And hopefully a lot of creative energy will be brought to that, of people wanting to do things that are not machine run, that are against transhumanism.
So let me suggest that we have a slogan.
Okay.
And I have a quick question just going on that keyword resistance. And obviously,
Yes, go ahead.
As a journalist and working for a major news organization, just again, going back to the data at the beginning about how newspaper revenues have fallen, as well as publishing revenues, as these tech companies have grown, social media, and we've all become dependent on sharing out all of our stories, all of our content on Facebook in order to get people to click and read. And then us as journalists, we have to have a certain amount of followers onto it, and that, which I personally find bullshit. What can, do you think us as if we have all the major global newspapers come together and just stop sharing their content, do you think that's, and then our readers will then just go to our websites to read our content, to find our content? Do you think that's possible, or is it?
Yes. What happened in Australia is the government actually got behind that move and forced Facebook to have to pay the news companies for every piece of content that was on their site. And I do believe that Ms. Vestager would back some kind of move to force companies to pay for the content, which then, of course, they would probably not want to do. And so they, then Facebook would be just cat videos and stupid political commentary from people who don't know anything. And maybe that's where it ends up. And so, but I agree with you. I think this is, these people, as I said at the beginning, are rentiers. They are getting gigantic profits off the work of other people and not paying for it.
Thank you.
There is also an organization that was started in Australia that I would recommend you to, which is called The Conversation. The Conversation. And it is essentially a wire service created, a nonprofit wire service created by Foundation Giving to link up scholars and academics like us with hundreds and hundreds of outlets that they provide content to in rural areas around the world, as well as in cities. So I think that there are other models we can look at, maybe that have to be worked out, but there are examples of what we are talking about.
Do we have if we have 10 minutes, we have 2-3 questions from real human beings from Europe here.
First of all, heartfelt thanks, because this session is absolutely mind-blowingly interesting and really exciting and moving. So I've just joined your resistance in the Vision Conference. But what you were saying just triggered some ideas that I just would like to put to you, because we discussed them this morning in a workshop slightly different, but which has a lot of points of convergence with what you're saying. So we were discussing this morning pushing a project about creating an entirely public service European multimedia website in which we would share quality information, films, documentary, news, and stories. And all of a sudden, when you were talking about the resistance, and our moderator mentioned, how do we do now without Facebook? Because we are so hooked, so dependent on it. And I was really wondering, what would be your thoughts? Do you think that it could be possible to envisage a completely not-for-profit, publicly funded, a coalition of states like Australia that have seen the dangers of Facebook? Or is it a completely visionary, unrealistic idea? Thank you.
So I would say.
Just another question.
Oh, okay.
We are going to collect all the questions, and at the end, you're going to answer.
Very quickly, I appreciate, this suggestion of resist, resist, resist. Give it up. I don't belong to any socials. Lots of people I know do not belong to socials. People who do belong, give it up.
Great conference indeed. What is your communications plan? It seems that the only thing that came across anti-Facebook, anti-GAFA so far is a movie by David Fincher, The Social Network. But besides that, it seems that Hollywood and media outlets have not been brave enough to produce something as powerful as this movie, which is now 12 years old. So the book is good, Mr. Taplin. I believe you should do a bit more.
Okay, so okay.
Okay, this was a very interesting discussion. Really, really very interesting. I have a couple of provocative questions. So although I share the view of Jonathan about resistance, which is very fascinating. The two questions are, what do you think the differences are in this kind of technological revolution with other revolutions we've had in the past, when industry was invented, when planes were invented, when television was invented? What is the difference now between those revolutions which haven't affected our lives a lot? The second question is even more provocative. I understand the risks of this, metaverse and whatever these, huge billionaires may be harmful to us. But I don't understand the link with democracy. Why is democracy at risk, given the fact that these billionaires were born within democratic systems?
Can I start? Let's not have too many questions before we won't remember them all. Okay, can I start with the last one? Because I think, I don't know what it's like in Italy, but in the United States, if you look at the change in the political structure of our country, at the point when the notions of whether elections were fair, whether people should take vaccine, whether all of these conspiracy theories which have risen up, they all came after social media was widely diffused in the United States. And so I believe that Facebook not only knew that they were putting out wrong, false, defamatory information and didn't care, but also that once they were confronted with the fact that this was happening, they made special rules for politicians that didn't have to go by the rules that anyone else as a citizen said, like hate speech problems and all of that. In other words, Donald Trump didn't have to abide by the hate speech rules that Facebook had in place. He could say that all Mexicans were rapists and he could put it on Facebook. So there was complicity on the part of the people who were running these companies, and that's just the facts. So as far as the earlier question about a public media system, I believe that's an important thing. And Ernie and I have both talked about this because Ernie was on the board of United States Corporation for Public Broadcasting. And it's only when you get outside of the advertising system that you have the freedom to do stuff and to be critical. And quite frankly, in the United States today, it's companies like ProPublica and shows like Frontline that are actually able to take on some of these issues. And that's because neither of them have to worry about advertisers. So I totally support that. In terms of the question of why we haven't had a film since David Fincher, you know, I'm a friend of David Fincher and I'm going to go tell him he needs to do a sequel to The Social Network, and he could call it The Metaverse. But the point is, I agree that artists need to be part of this. I made in most of the books that I've written recently the point that culture precedes politics, that the artists lead. When Ernie cited Bob Dylan in 1963 going down to Mississippi to try and get people to register to vote, that was 4 years before Lyndon Johnson put through a Voting Rights Act. So, I mean, the artists are always on the cutting edge and should continue. Although, quite frankly, in the US today, I would more look to the basketball players than I would look to the hip hop artists in terms of political involvement. You know, I mean, Jay-Z is too busy selling his champagne company, and LeBron James is out there trying to get people to vote. So in terms of revolutions, the Italian philosopher Gramsci, who I know is not quoted a lot these days because he was a Marxist, said, the problem consists that the old is dying and the new cannot be born. In this interregnum, many morbid symptoms appear. What we are experiencing and what Ernie and I are talking about are the morbid symptoms of an interregnum. The old system, the old media system, the old power system is dying, and a new one is trying to be pushed into us, and it's not ready for prime time. In other words, 2 years ago, Boeing sent a jet out of an airport in Far East, and they had installed an automated system that would overtake the pilots if they thought the pilots were doing the wrong thing. And so the plane from Lion Air starts going into a dive. I mean, the automated system thought the plane was too high and put it into a dive. And when the pilots tried to undo it, every time they would try and straighten it out, the automated system, the artificial intelligence, which was smarter than the pilots, put it into the dive, and 250 people died. That's belief in AI that was not relevant or not verified. And that is the kind of situation we're in right now. We are having all these kinds of new ideas that we should jump into the metaverse. And I believe it's basically wrong. And so, I mean, we're in a very strange time right now. This revolution is not like previous revolutions, because the television was not with you 24/7 in the palm of your hand. And the internet is. And the television did not spy on you and send Facebook data as to where you went, what you bought, who you talked to, everything. And this is new. And this is unlike any revolution that has come before. And until we accept that, we're going to just be and not know what's going on. It's just like the politicians don't have a clue of what's going on. And the people who own the big companies, they've got all the data and they know what's going on. And Peter Thiel has said, he said, 2% of the people, the VCs, the scientists, and the entrepreneurs, what's going on, and 98% of the people don't have a clue. And that's the attitude they take.
Thank you.
John, thank you very much. We are all moved, and it has been really great. This thing has been enabled by a technology, which is called Zoom, and by human spirit. Thanks a lot, John, and also to Ernest.
Appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We wait for you here, in person, without Zoom.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Bye.
Thanks, bye.
See you.